Hi, everyone. It's great to meet you all and hope you've been staying safe and staying healthy. My name is Zhang, and a little bit about me. I started my career in web product management and moved over to mobile when an opportunity came up at Atlassian. But at the time, there weren't too many resources available that summarized the difference between the two roles, which for me made it really hard to know what to expect. So, in aiming to improve this knowledge gap, I'd love to share my learnings, both big and small, that I've gathered in the last few years, so that there's more information and data points available for others to refer to. This talk will be useful for you if you're interested in learning about my observations for the differences between PMing in a web space versus a mobile space, which can help inform a decision if you're hoping to choose between one or the other, can help inform a decision if you're hoping to switch from one to another, or if you've recently made the switch, help you ramp up faster with some of my learnings. Quick preface before we jump in. When I say web, I'm talking about product management for SaaS or software as a service-based web applications or software that you would get through a browser versus downloading a traditional desktop application. When I say mobile, I'm talking purely about the mobile native apps that you would download from the App Store or from Google Play Store. I'm not talking about mobile web or the mobile browser experience. And one last thing to note is that my experience is deeply rooted in being a user-centric, experience-driven PM in a workplace productivity space. So note that bits of what I'm sharing won't be applicable across all industries, all company sizes, all roles. So keeping in mind that I'm telling the story from this particular lens. Okay, so let's go ahead and get started. It's often said that product management is this intersection between user experience, tech, as well as strategy. So let's go ahead and talk about my learnings in these three general categories, starting off with differences in user experience. So for this particular part, I'd like to cover some implications of different screen sizes, of different device orientations that are available, of how folks engage with your product, whether that be through their hands or their fingers versus cursors, and then finally, some differences in design guidelines as well. So getting started, kicking us off with screen sizes and device orientations. This one is probably the most obvious and probably the one that comes to mind when you think about, hey, what's the difference between web and mobile? With web, you have the luxury of more space, and with the slight exception of differences in monitor sizes and screen resolutions, one design generally fits most. But with mobile, it's really not that straightforward because on one end of the spectrum, you have mobile phones, and with it being the most constrained form factor, you need to be really careful about what to include and be laser focused on what user challenges you want to solve for with the app. Something that people don't realize all the time is that the other end of the spectrum, which is also under the mobile umbrella, are tablets like iPad, for example. And not only is there a screen size difference between phones and tablets, but the situation for which users would engage with each of these options may differ quite a bit. So, whereas phones could be really task oriented, like I want to do this quick thing as I'm standing in line getting coffee, tablets are oftentimes viewed as a lighter alternative to a laptop. So, it's generally not great practice to just lift and shift whatever your phone design is and simply like stretch it out on iPad, hoping that it works out. The other wrinkle in all this is device orientations, which generally isn't a really big area for focus for web UX, but for phones and tablets, you have vertical and horizontal orientation modes, are sometimes referred to as landscape and portrait modes, which sounds like it's not a huge deal, but you'd actually be shocked at how poorly certain experiences are rendered across different device orientation styles and how it's really important to actually keep that into consideration throughout both your design, but also your quality assurance or QA phase. The only real alternative that I can think of for web for all these various cases to consider is maybe responsive app design, where when you shrink the size of your browser, you're essentially representing your app in a way that's still easy to use and it responds to the overall size of the browser and there's not crazy buttons overlapping. But oftentimes it's not always adhered to or expected to be adhered to, whereas on mobile, it's absolutely critical to think through these various scenarios. A few other differences is considering how users physically interact with their laptops or with their phones. For phones in particular, if you choose to place a button at the top right or left-hand corner of your app, it's actually going to be pretty challenging for your users to take that action with one hand, which is how users predominantly hold their device because it's far away from their action figure, which is the thumb. The piece of knowledge there is helpful for considering where you should place a very common action. And going into mobile product management, that was not on my mind at all because on web, users have a mouse to interact with their screen. And for the most part, all parts of the screen are more or less the same level of effort to get to. Another implication of having a mouse or a cursor on web is that on web, you can have tooltips and hover states where if your cursor is going over a specific button, you can actually include some type of flyout to give additional context into what that particular button does or what you might want to expect from that particular experience. And I'll admit, there's definitely been times in web where we use this as okay, it's kind of like supplementary information for what a particular item would do. But on mobile, it's really not that straightforward. You can't just lean on these tooltips or hover tips because there's not a very easy equivalent other than maybe force touch or long press, but honestly, not as discoverable and not as commonly used. So you'll have to be more confident that your experience is pretty self-explanatory, something that's a lot harder to do, in my opinion, without that particular option of the hover and the tooltip. Lastly, one other observation that I have is mobile apps actually come with their own pretty detailed set of design guidelines. On Android, you have material design. On iOS, you have human interface guidelines. These are really good places to start if you're kind of curious about mobile PM as a particular job option for you. They theoretically exist also for desktop-based applications, but to be honest, I don't know if it was considered as frequently in the development process because there wasn't a single authority for guidelines in web app design. I think the closest thing that I can think of is maybe the World Wide Web Consortium or W3C, which they'll have accessibility guidelines, for example, which are super helpful, but not nearly to the degree of detail for UI design in comparison to the ones available for mobile apps. So for our team, we actually take into consideration what these guidelines are pretty heavily in conjunction with our overall brand and design system guidelines. So something to note is that there's a lot of stuff out of the box here that you can actually use for your design. Next, let's move over into differences in technology. For this particular section, there's a few differences I'd like to note. The first around differences in release cycles, some platform differences that I've noticed, as well as the difference in the pace of innovation. So talking about release cycles, the biggest difference between web and mobile releases are how quickly your changes can reach end users. Whereas on web, you deploy the latest version of the web app. After doing that, the next time somebody refreshes their browser or opens the browser, they can get the latest version. It's pretty straightforward. But on mobile, it's not quite that simple because for each release candidate, you actually need to go through an approvals process from each respective app store. And it's not like hey, quick 5-minute thing. It actually takes quite a bit of time. And once it does actually hit the app store, some people have auto update turned on, but not all do, meaning people have to manually go in and update to the latest version. So by the time a version is approved to roll out and properly installed by users, it can actually be a several week time frame. And by that same reasoning, you actually can't roll back easily on a previous version of mobile like you could on web. So on web, if you notice a weird experience in your latest version, one that you think, is not acceptable, you could very easily roll back to the previous version. And the next time somebody refreshes or opens their browser, it can just be that previous version. But on mobile, if you wanted to do something similar, good luck, because you actually have to publish another version and go through that same lengthy process to have that previous experience. So implications of these two being that bugs actually live a lot longer on the mobile app due to the release process and the way users adopt the latest versions of the app. So when you do release a version, it's good to have this measure twice, cut once type mentality because it can be really difficult to quickly make updates. And then rolling out changes and getting signals in terms of usage for a new feature, whether that be your success metrics, your KPIs, how it might impact engagement, for example, can actually take a while longer due to that overall release cycle. Some other platform differences noted. So for web apps, the bulk of the variability for your app you get through different browsers like Chrome, Safari, Firefox, for example. Understanding the slight differences in behavior across browser types and the types of demographics that use certain browsers are also important. There's actually age and gender differences in browser usage that not many folks are aware of. And also, when you QA your product, you'll have to run different test cases through different browsers because there can be browser specific bugs. But other than that, there's not too many crazy changes across the different browsers that one might use to access your application. But on mobile, the difference is quite substantial and stems from the OS or the operating system. It can range from different tooling to geographical differences in the audience base. In fact, there's so many differences that we could probably do a whole talk just on Android and iOS ecosystem differences, but I won't go into that today. The biggest one that I'll highlight is the amount of customization each platform allows. So Android is open source, meaning anybody can take bits of the Android code and customize it. Samsung phones and Pixel phones, for example, both run Android, but are quite different in terms of the software look and feel. Apple, for the most part, is not open source for various reasons, like wanting to have a tighter ecosystem for consistent designs, et cetera. They're generally a little bit more stringent overall. The customization is what allows these crazy Pokemon skins to be possible for apps to be represented like Pokeballs or specific Pokemon. This level of freedom to customize apps or to customize the overall look and feel can actually impact your development process. So a few learnings that I had on the job, one was I couldn't cap the notification count on iOS to 10 plus notifications, whereas on Android I could. iOS I had to include an absolute count. I couldn't put a beta label on an iOS release, but I could on Android. And one implication of the different level of customization capabilities on Android is that there's also more fragmentation, meaning more device types that are slightly more tweaked out in the wild, which bumps the chances of variability in your product. So what might look one way on one phone might look really different on another. So this particular table here with all the crazy colors represents the amount of device fragmentation that exists on Android. One thing to note and one thing to add on here is, and I don't think folks are readily aware unless you're working already in the development aspect or the development side of the house for your current role, is that differences between iOS and Android are so different that most mobile teams I've seen actually have a different team for developers on iOS and for Android. Assuming that the underlying technology is fully native versus like a React native that's based off of JavaScript, if you want to introduce a feature, it's very likely you'll need to work with two different teams, an Android team and an iOS team, meaning two different sets of milestones, two different sets of tickets. I've also seen cases though where there's one PM that will PM everything Android and one PM that will PM everything iOS, but I see that less than the you introduce a feature as a mobile PM and it's cross-cutting across both iOS as well as Android. Lastly, the pace of innovation. So this one is subject to debate. Let me know if you disagree. I'm happy to chat about it some more, but this is my overall perception. The pace of innovation on mobile devices and mobile operating systems is way faster than browser innovation. Things change so fast, and it seems every year during the developer conference, whether that be WWDC for iOS or Google I/O for Android, that there's these groundbreaking new announcements that can really impact how your users interact with your app. It's really, really exciting, but the implication here is that it can actually alter your roadmap pretty significantly in an unexpected way. And here's why. These updates can be pretty hush-hush until the splashy announcement during the developer conference, meaning there could be these massive changes coming, but feel very sudden because you just learn about all of them at once during that conference, and you're kind of forced to adapt. The other thing is the pace at which a mobile feature is a delighter or a feature that's unexpected, but oh, really awesome to have, can become table stakes in a very fast time frame. So you might have one thing that's introduced the beginning of the year, but by the end of the year, it's widely adopted. And then suddenly all your users expect it. It's just, if you don't have it, it's crazy that you don't have it because all of the other apps have it. An example of this being dark mode, for example. Dark mode was introduced and it was introduced at the OS level, meaning you can set your overall device theme to be dark mode. And if all of your screens are in dark mode, when you open an app, you expect it to adhere to that specific theming. And if not, it becomes this very glaring, like, what? This is crazy. It's very different than what I would expect, which means a wave of feedback from your users. So if you don't catch the train of change and you don't adjust your roadmap to the innovation, you can quickly become subject to a lot of feedback from your users. In my web app days, I just didn't have a really similar experience with anything else. I never had to keep tabs on like the crazy amount of browser or innovation from any other front like that, where I would need to potentially blow up my roadmap because of this incoming change. It's kind of a different culture, I would say, and a different pace at which things move. Okay, let's move over to the last section, which is differences in shaping strategy. So, at a high level, a well formed strategy and vision takes into consideration a lot of different inputs. Not to say that this is all encompassing, but three very important inputs are understanding your inherent strength, understanding qualitative feedback, and then also understanding quantitative insights. These are slightly different across mobile and web, and I'd love to kind of share that difference with you all today. So, first is really important to understand your inherent strength. This actually differs quite a bit with web apps and mobile apps. This is a really high level summary and it's not touching everything, but very high level on web, it's easy to accomplish more complex tasks due to the larger screen sizes. In addition to that, you can have multiple windows and browsers open pretty easily, toggle between the two. You have access to a full size keyboard. You also have additional monitors if you want more real estate. And for that reason, I would never try to do taxes on my phone because I'd have to refer to a lot of different sources. And I also feel like the opportunity for error on mobile is higher because of the smaller screen size and because of the keyboard and my chubbier than average fingers. I just think something could go wrong, which I wouldn't want to for something so important like that. Mobile, on the other hand, you get easier access to dictation or voice to text, camera, push notifications, location settings, offline support. It's a huge strength for mobile for the fact that like people always have their mobile device with them wherever they go. Directions for Google Maps, for example, is really awesome for mobile because I can base directions off of my location at the time and because I can easily have it accessible from my pocket. I couldn't imagine trying to load directions on the web app and then taking my laptop with me so that I can have those directions with me or trying to print it out. It just doesn't work as well for that particular use case. So your inherent strength differs quite a bit based on the platform that you're working on, even if it's the same feature. So being really careful to understand what that is will be really critical to shaping your overall strategy and for your overall product area success. Understanding user sentiment, user pain points via qualitative feedback is also really critical in terms of an input into your strategy. And on mobile, you actually have a tighter feedback loop via the App Store and Google Play Store reviews out of the box. Not to say that this can't be replicated easily for web apps via other platforms and tools, but on mobile, it's a nice bonus and you kind of just get it for free. So when I first joined the team, I spent the first day just combing through these reviews to understand what are the biggest user challenges today. And it was really nice to have that option in addition to a few other channels for feedback that existed. Not only that, but simply being able to read and aggregate reviews isn't the core value. I would say the core value is that you can interact with them and be able to have users clarify a point that they've made, or you can even offer to set up maybe a 30-minute chat if they want to get deeper with their feedback and want to talk to the development team. So really being able to have that tighter feedback loop while also aggregating overall trends is super, super helpful. And something that isn't necessarily out of the box with certain web experiences. The other thing to note is quantitative insights or data insights are also really valuable for shaping your overall strategy. And one thing that was really new to me and that's different for web versus mobile is mobile, you have this concept of app stores and app store optimizations. The preview images you use, the copy, your ratings, your rating volume can all impact conversion rate for which people download your app. And there's actually very specific strategies that people will employ to boost these numbers. And it was a really interesting whole new world for me coming from the world of web where there isn't necessarily this equivalent thing to consider specifically for app store optimizations. And the other thing that's kind of available provided through Google Play and App Analytics is the console for which you can actually interact with a few vital signs of your app. So there's a ton of really interesting data around your app's retention, deletion, crash rates by demographic. You can actually separate out a lot of these actions and a lot of these vital signs by cohorts. So really, really awesome data that you have at your fingertips to understand about your specific app. So if you love numbers and are maybe at an org where not a lot of users or a lot of user events rather are instrumented or tracked, going the mobile route because you have these analytics out of the box could be a really good alternative. So we've talked about, what are the differences in user experience? What are the differences in technology? What are the differences in strategy? To succinctly summarize, the different options to kind of consider when you're choosing between the two, here's what I've put together in terms of the overall thoughts that I have on this particular matter. The first one is the biggest difference in my mind, and the one that impacts you the most, is the level of like the margin of error that you can have. So on mobile, this is much smaller because of the nature of release cycles and smaller screen sizes. You better be sure that your release version is free of bugs and wonky experiences, because once it's out in the wild, it's going to be really, really hard to update or pull that back. And from a user standpoint, because of the smaller screen size, you better be absolutely sure that the features you do want to feature prominently on your mobile screen are the items that users actually want. You're solving the actual user need in a very small, kind of limited real estate way. So if you aren't laser focused on what your users want, you could very easily be missing the mark. So if you like that kind of challenge, I'd say mobile is a really great space for you to be in. The other thing is, if you like staying up with the latest tech, staying up to speed with the latest tech, and you like this rapid innovation, I'd say that the pace of change is really much faster on mobile. There's so many new OS or operating system type updates that can really impact the direction of your roadmap in a really exciting way. And to be honest, I didn't experience this with web. So if the fact that your roadmap might alter because of a developers conference and that kind of stresses you out and you prefer to maintain a more predictable roadmap, web might be a better alternative for you. But if the thought of rapid change excites you, then maybe mobile is a better space for you to be in because of the fact that there's constant innovation that happens on a yearly basis. The other thing is, if you're at an org where channels for user feedback or data instrumentation is not as developed, but you really crave that insight, mobile actually provides a really nice alternative in that Apple and Google already offer you, as a mobile developer, a lot of these qualitative and quantitative insights out of the box. It can make your job a lot easier as a PM if you have these insights available to you readily. So, thing to note there for sure. But with all of this in mind, my final recommendation to you is that if you have the opportunity to, you should try both. The intention and setting in which users are engaging with your product is just truly quite different across both platforms. And the fact that users today navigate across different devices throughout their day, they're not staying on just web, they're not staying on just mobile. The boundaries are more fluid. And to truly solve for a particular pain point, I think it's incredibly important to solve for cross-device experiences and think about the interplay between phones, tablets, phablets, and desktop workstations. To have your skill set and knowledge confined to just one, I don't think is worthwhile, in my opinion. I think if you could and you have the opportunity, why not understand both? So that concludes my talk. Thank you all for taking the time. Would love to hear in the comments below if you've got any questions or if you had a different experience than I did. Would also love to hear about that. Cheers, and thank you again for your time.